The midnight cleaner. Frank Walters had been working the night shift as a janitor for nearly a decade. He liked the quiet. While most people found the idea of an empty office building at night unsettling, Frank appreciated the solitude. The hum of fluorescent lights, the dull sound of his mop against the tiled floors, and the occasional rustle of papers were his companions. There was something peaceful about working while the world slept. But lately, peace was hard to come by. The office building, a towering monolith of glass and steel, had seen better days. It was old, and it had its quirks: creaky elevators, faulty wiring, and a heating system that sometimes sounded like it was possessed. But over the past few weeks, things had begun to feel off. It started with the small things. Frank would arrive at work at midnight, as he always did, and begin his rounds. He'd enter an office to find papers scattered across a desk that had been clean only moments before. He shrugged it off, thinking maybe he hadn't noticed the mess earlier. Then there were the doors. Frank had always been methodical, closing doors behind him as he worked through each floor. But time and time again, he'd hear a door slam shut from behind him, only to turn around and see nothing. He told himself it was the wind. Old buildings had drafts, and sometimes they caught just right, making doors move on their own. But the footsteps were harder to explain. One night, as Frank was mopping the lobby floor, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. The office building was empty, always was at this hour, but the footsteps were clear, steady, and heading toward him. "Hello?" Frank called out, his voice sounding too loud in the silence. No response. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Frank stood frozen, his heart thumping in his chest. He listened, straining to hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the eerie hum of the building. He shook his head, embarrassed at his own fear, and returned to his work. But the occurrences didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent and more intense. Phones would ring in empty offices, only to go silent as soon as Frank picked up. The sound of typing would drift from rooms where no one sat at a desk. Once, Frank even heard a printer whirring to life, spitting out page after page of nonsense, lines of random numbers and letters. He wasn't the superstitious type, but something about the building felt different now, darker. And as much as Frank tried to ignore it, the sensation of being watched never left him. One night, after yet another strange occurrence, a stack of papers inexplicably falling to the floor, Frank decided to check the security footage. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe someone else was sneaking into the building and playing tricks on him. After all, the city wasn't short on people looking for trouble. He made his way to the security office in the basement, where a bank of monitors displayed feeds from cameras throughout the building. Frank rewound the footage from earlier in the night, focusing on the moment when the papers had fallen. He watched as he entered the office, mop in hand, and walked past the desk. The papers were neatly stacked just as he remembered, but then something strange happened. As Frank bent down to pick up a trash can, the papers on the desk began to move. Slowly, deliberately. It was as if an invisible hand was shuffling through them. Frank leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing. He watched in disbelief as the papers flew off the desk, scattering across the floor. He was standing only a few feet away, completely unaware. "What the hell?" he muttered. But that wasn't the worst part. He fast-forwarded the footage, scrolling through the various cameras. As he did, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There he was, walking down the hallway, pushing his mop bucket as usual. But behind him, just out of sight, were shadows. They weren't like the natural shadows cast by the flickering lights. These were darker, denser, and they moved on their own. At one point, the shadows seemed to extend, reaching out toward him, but always pulling back just before he turned around. He fast-forwarded again, this time to the footage from the lobby, where he had heard the footsteps. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw himself mopping the floor. And then, just as before, the shadows appeared. This time, though, they weren't just lurking. They were standing, figures, barely discernible, but unmistakably human-shaped. And they were watching him. Frank recoiled from the monitor. His mind raced. What the hell was happening in this building? Was it haunted? The idea seemed absurd, but the evidence was right there on the screen. He shut off the monitors and sat back in the chair, his hands shaking. He had to know more. If the building was haunted, there had to be a reason. Maybe something had happened here, something that had left a mark. Frank remembered Carol, one of the building's longest employees, once mentioning a fire. She'd been with the company for years, well before Frank started, and she liked to talk. He'd always tuned her out, but now he regretted not paying more attention. The next day, he tracked Carol down. "Hey, Carol," Frank said, trying to sound casual. "I was wondering, didn't you mention something about a fire in the building a long time ago?" Carol's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, that was years ago, before they even built this new section. It happened in the original office wing. A tragic accident, really. The fire broke out overnight and a few employees were still working late. They never made it out." Frank's heart sank. "Do you know what caused it?" "They said it was electrical, faulty wiring or something. But some people think it wasn't an accident. They say the place was cursed after that." "Cursed?" Frank tried to keep his voice steady. Carol shrugged. "People like to tell stories, you know? But I'll tell you this. Since I've been here, there's always been something strange about the night shift." Frank left the conversation more unsettled than before. He couldn't shake the feeling that the fire and the strange occurrences he'd been experiencing were connected. Were the spirits of those employees still trapped in the building? Was that who or what had been watching him on the security footage? That night, as Frank began his shift, he felt the weight of the building pressing down on him. Every creak, every gust of wind seemed more ominous. He tried to go about his routine, but his eyes kept darting to the shadows, half expecting them to come to life again. As he entered one of the older office wings, the temperature seemed to drop. His breath fogged the air, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He tried to shake it off, but the oppressive feeling only grew stronger. Then, from somewhere down the hall, he heard it. The sound of typing. Frank froze. There were no employees here. He checked the building thoroughly before starting his rounds, but the sound was unmistakable. Keys clacking rhythmically, as though someone was working late. He slowly made his way toward the sound, his heart pounding. The hallway stretched out in front of him, darker than usual. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. When he reached the source of the noise, his stomach dropped. The office was empty, but the typewriter on the desk was moving. The keys were pressing down, one by one, typing out a message that sent a chill down Frank's spine. "Help us." Frank staggered back, knocking over his mop bucket. Water spilled across the floor, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his ears. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, panic rising in his chest. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and writhe, forming dark, indistinct shapes. He could feel their eyes on him, could hear their whispers. "Get out, leave," the voices murmured, overlapping and growing louder with each passing second. Frank bolted for the door, yanking it open and stumbling into the hallway. He ran, his footsteps echoing off the walls. Behind him, he could hear the whispering voices chasing him, growing louder, angrier. He didn't stop until he reached the lobby, panting and drenched in sweat. He leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. The voices had stopped, but the oppressive feeling still lingered. Frank knew he couldn't keep working here. The spirits, whatever they were, weren't going to leave him alone. They wanted something, and he wasn't about to stick around to find out what. The next morning, Frank handed in his resignation. He didn't give a reason. He didn't need to. The building had taken something from him, something he wasn't sure he'd ever get back. As he walked away from the towering office block for the last time, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching him, waiting for their next victim to wander in.